Hey everybody, welcome to today's video on the channel, and in today's video I'll be ranking all the storm spells on this tier list right here. Now this will be primarily focused around PvP, obviously. However, some of these spells are, really good in PvE, and a lot of these spells are actually very outdated. So what I'm going to do is throw the actual spells in 2023 up on screen when I'm talking about a specific spell. For example, King Artorias right here does not give a 10% accuracy buff anymore. I'll throw the image up on King Artorias now. And yeah, that is basically going to be the video. If you guys disagree with anything, let me know down there in the comments below. I always look forward to reading your feedback, and yeah, let's get right into things right away, guys. All right, so starting off with Astrophobia, I believe the spell is called. It gives you 20% pierce and 20% critical for a storm bubble for 4 pips. Now, this on paper isn't a bad idea, but the main issue is this competes with the hit and bubble, which is also 4 pips. Now, a hit and bubble will break off debuffs and put up a solid damage bubble, which is just really, really good when you compare it to this, because that's a tempo move and a really solid damage buff at the same time. This doesn't give you any tempo, and it doesn't even give you a damage buff, aside from what is that, like 2% more damage on the crit maybe. It's just really not that impactful, the 4 pip bubbles, and when you compare them to the 4 pip hidden bubbles, they basically are just outclassed in every way. So in my opinion, this spell is easily C tier or could use a buff. I'll probably put it in C tier for now because I do think it has some uses in PvE where you might need really high pierce to get around like a 100 shield or 100 resist, right? It could be good there in PvE, but just really not that good compared to the hit and bubble. Next up, we have Catalan. Now, Catalan got a pretty big buff when the storm, the huge storm buff came out a couple of months ago. About a year ago now, I'd say it's been around that ballpark. This spell is basically like a mini Ifrit, but for Storm, and it's like 3 less pips. So it's honestly really good. It helps Storm quite a bit in every league. In my opinion, I would probably put it S or A tier. I'm not sure if it's worthy of being S tier with a lot of these other spells on the tier list, but I think because it's so versatile in every league, and for the most part, it is always a good move, it could probably easily just be S tier, and I think that is going to be our first one. It's just because of how accessible, versatile it is, and how reliable and game-changing this spell is, You can just Catalan your opponent to death unless they're a myth where they can like Stone Colossus through. The weakness is so impactful that it's always a good move and your opponent has to play around it. And it's very good in faster matchups, obviously, where you can kind of negate a buff and a half with that really powerful weakness. Definitely has to be an S tier spot in this tier list. Next up, we have the new catch of the day. Honestly, I think I probably preferred the old one, if I'm being honest, but it didn't really suit Storm's school identity anymore, unfortunately. So, catch right now, on paper, it's not bad. I think what holds catch back probably from being S tier is a couple of things. One, the damage is really bad when you compare it to Catalan side by side here. Two, the 245 blades are pretty nice, yeah, but when you compare it to stuff like -60, -65 death weaknesses, it just kind of gets outclassed in every way. And 3, if your opponent has like a really good blade counter, like, I don't know, Banshee or Ice Wyvern, it'll just absolutely get stomped and your damage per pip won't matter because it's already so low. So I'd probably put catch at A or B tier. I think if the damage was just a little bit higher, I'd probably put it in S tier, but I don't think it's, quite that good. I think it's easily A tier, just not as good universally like Caddy is, and the damage per pip on it is just a little bit too low for my liking with the blade percentage on it. Next up, King Artorias. King Artorias, I think, is a very solid storm hit, very underrated right now in the meta. In my opinion, I think the only thing that holds this card back is probably the weak Pierce Blade you get back on a Storm. You know, it's only 10% Pierce. If it was like 30 or 40, even like, I don't know, 20 or 30, I think, it would just be a lot better, in my opinion. It's not a bad card on paper, but I don't think it got audited with the summer audit. So it's still kind of like in this weird place where its damage is like okay, but it's nothing special, and the Pierce Blade is kind of underwhelming. So it's a very good card situationally. I've won plenty of games with it, but on paper, it's just not that great for a Storm spell, unfortunately. Cleanse Charm, I think this is a pretty easy C tier. It has its uses in PvE and sometimes in PvP, but not really in PvP. It's kind of decent, especially if people infection a Storm. It's pretty good as a counter move, but it's not really anything above that, really, at the moment. Dark Wind, obviously S tier. 2-pip bubbles are basically meta for every school. Just really solid, without a doubt, without question. Really cracked cards. Disarm, this is 0 pips now, I believe, which is actually pretty cool. It's not 1 pip anymore. Disarm isn't really that great, you know? It still follows the old identity of Storm, where, like, they're blade removal, and nowadays they're not. So I think Disarm is probably with C tier. You know, it has its uses, but most of the time, if you're holding on to a Disarm, you're probably just better off doing something else, typically right now, at least in the PvP meta. It could be good, I guess, like, I don't know, if your opponent supercharges and you're trying to get pips, but nobody supercharges, and it's just too situational, in my opinion. And I don't think it should get any buffs because it already doesn't follow Storm Identity. So I would just leave it as C tier. It's kind of mid. Storm Dispel, B tier, easy. You know, obviously very situational, but Dispels in general are just really game changing, whether it's like Shrike plays or stalling to get your hand together or stalling out an aura or stuff like that. Just really, really solid, situational, but when you have a Dispel, they're always like the best thing to have in the game, basically. Enfeeble, easily S tier, right? This is probably the only good blade counter in the entire game right now after the Putrefaction nerf. Wall of Blades is kind of mid. Banshee is pretty good, yeah, but none of those cards can just completely erase what your opponent is doing right now. The only drawback from this card is you don't like debuff them in the same turn. It's just, you know, puts the board state back to neutral. But I mean, sometimes that's all you need against these really simple linear strats. It's just one good Enfeeble, and it's over basically. So I think easily an S tier card right now. Glowbug Squall, I think, is probably gonna have to be around the B tier. It's not used in PvP simply because you just have better shads at the moment, and there's literally no utility on it to warrant using right now. PvE, it's a really solid shad. I think it's only competing with Sound and Musicology, but really solid shad in PvE, and it's a fan favorite. Healing Current needs a buff, pretty much. It did get audited. It's probably honestly worse now than it was before, in my opinion. This spell just really needs a buff if they want Storm Wizards to be healing in PvP. Old Insane Bolt, easily would put that at S tier, but the new Insane Bolt is really bad, probably one of the worst spells in the game, alongside a Healing Current, which is really sad to see that all these unique Storm spells are just really, really bad right now. I'd like to see a buff to the new Insane Bolt because I haven't seen a single person use that since the audit. The risk is just way too high, and the damage is way too low on the spell. And also flat resist at max level negates a lot of it, so not a very good card. I would like to see a buff on it. Sultan, I think Sultan is B tier. It's pretty good for a Storm, pretty decent TPP. I do not think it has been audited to the new damage per pip, all the 4 pips. So if I had to guess, the spell is actually supposed to be a lot more powerful, and it just isn't at the moment. So it's really good. You know, if you have a good 4 pip at the end of the game, your opponent won't expect it, and it's a lot of damage. You never want to use this at the start of the game. It's always more of a finisher where your opponent has to bank on you not really having it, but It's a decent spell. I would love to see it get buffed maybe in the future when they audit Mirage spells. Kraken Spellament. Now, Kraken Spellament is really, really freaking good right now. And I think I'm going to probably have to put this at, S tier. This spell, just really solid damage, a lot of tempo you can get, and it's one of the only ways to viably counter protected overtimes right now in the game. So, decent damage per pip. Blades are kind of crappy, but that's okay, I guess. And obviously you remove a protected overtime, so really great spell right now in the meta where overtimes are very popular. Leviathan, easy A tier. This spell still does not follow the new system with Wiz, but Leviathan right now is just really bad in terms of damage per pip, at least in the main deck. The TC Leviathan was pretty good, and this one on screen actually is probably pretty good. I'd run that, but the one we have right now in main deck is just really, really bad and underwhelming. So I don't honestly even bother packing it because the DPP sucks. But doing an okay chunk of damage while removing 2 rounds, and just the fact that you can 2-shot people on a storm as well is incredibly, incredibly helpful and a pretty decent spell. I just think the damage per pip is really holding it back right now. Lightning Bats, Spellament. I think this is going to have to go in C tier. The issue with this card is that damage per pip is so low, and it does not counter protected, and the weaknesses, the value on the weaknesses are just really bad. People will hit through 15% like it's literally nothing, like it doesn't even exist. So this spell just doesn't really have a place in the game right now, unfortunately. You lose too much damage compared to the base one. The 2 weaknesses don't really mean much, and that's pretty much why it's not really great right now. It's very situational, but you're always better off Krakening at the moment. Lightning Strike, I mean, I'm going to easily put that in needs a buff. This spell is just really crappy. It did get buffed to like 25%, but it's still pretty crappy. Nobody uses this card past 5 minutes into the game. And then they realize, okay, it's kind of stupid, so could use an audit or a buff. Mass Storm Trap for PvE, pretty solid card, very helpful when you're questing with a friend. You can easily just circumvent people having Storm Resist or get around sets. Also pretty good in team PvP, easily A tier. Soothe, and I think I'm going to get the rest of this stuff out of the way. Actually, Soothe and the minions all just kind of need a buff in general. Let me go ahead and move all this minion stuff, Soothe, into the needs buff area here. And is there anything else we can put in here? Storm minion isn't even in the game, so needs a buff. I mean, pretty self-explanatory. They're literally just not in the game right now. And the minion cards, obviously, you can't use them if they're not in the game. And the target thing is just kind of outdated right now at this point and doesn't really reflect on school identity at all. Next up, we have Queen Calypso. I think Queen Calypso is easily probably going to have to be S tier right now. This spell, decent damage per pip, and just completely shuts down healing if you're on a storm or any school right now. Very, very solid card. Probably the best heal counter in the game, in my opinion. And yeah, it's pretty solid. Next up, we have Rusalka. Now, this one is 1445. I wish I played back when it was 1445. Damn, bro. I want Rusalka to do damage, but it doesn't really do damage nowadays, unfortunately. Sad reacts. Rusalka, well, if I'm going to rank this meta and this Rusalka, I think this Rusalka is probably one of the worst ones we've seen, because you can get the wrong blade back and then lose the game. And the damage per pip doesn't really matter because your stats are way worse than everybody else. So at that point, the game's like not even playable with Rusalka. I would put Rusalka S tier if they didn't add the heal blade. Like, here's the test round version where you always got a blade back, but the blade was like 15, 20, or 30. I'd put that S tier, but I think this version of Rusalka is easily B tier, you know. Doesn't do a lot of damage because of stat burden at max level, And the utility on it is literally win or lose the game. At that point, you're gambling like old Insane Bolt, you know. Uh, Decent card, not that great because of the devs' design choices in the game, unfortunately, at the moment. Storm Scion, I think this spell is actually pretty decent in my opinion. I think I'm going to put it in B tier with Rusalka. I think Blade Stack got a good buff this update, and the DPP is pretty decent on a Storm Scion. However, I think Blade counters like Banshee and Ice Wyvern are just really solid to the point where you're kind of scared to do any of this on a Storm at the moment. Sirens, I'm going to put that spell under it needs a buff. Just really bad damage per pip, and it's giving a utility mantle, which nobody really cares for because you just want to kill them with a Siren and you don't need the utility when they're already dead. So, yeah, I think needs a buff for sure. Good old Stormblade, I think I'm going to have to put this one at A tier probably. You know, just one Stormblade can basically make you win or lose the game in general. You know, Storm DPP is pretty decent aside from max level, and you just get a lot of tempo just by simply blading on a Storm, and you can make your opponent really afraid of you. So, really solid card in my opinion. Stormlord, jeez, y'all might hate me for this one, but I think I'm gonna have to put Stormlord in B tier. Now, you guys are probably thinking, Liam, what the hell are you doing? Now, hear me out, guys, okay? Stormlord, when you compare this to a spell like Artorias, right? You're literally just doing less damage. You're just doing less damage compared to Artorias, okay? That's the issue with this spell. So your damage per pip doesn't really matter, and the stun to all also doesn't really matter when they're pretty much just already dead in PvE. Now, in PvP, it's a bit different of a story because the stun actually might work if your opponent doesn't stun block, but even then in PvP, you're still doing less damage than like Artorias when Myth already has better stats than Storm in PvP. So I think this spell, just the damage per pip is way too low right now. If it was the TC version where it's like 795 or whatever, I'd probably easily put this one like, I don't know, A or S tier easily, but I think 690 for 7 pips on a Storm is just way too underwhelming, especially when you compare it to Artorias right now. Storm Owl. Now, I'd put this Storm Owl right here, A tier, but unfortunately we got nerfed pretty hard and it hasn't been audited yet. So I think Storm Owl right now is probably going to be in C tier. You know, I think King Art is honestly a little bit better than the new Storm Owl, in my opinion. I think Storm Owl is just way too weak as a Storm spell for 10 pips, you know, especially when you compare it to something like this one you see on screen right now. This new Storm Owl is just a joke and really, really bad and crappy. So I think this spell needs a buff, in my opinion, for Storm. There's just too little damage for 10 pips on a Storm. Even just like 100 damage buff would probably make this spell be used quite a bit more, but just a little bit too weak, got nerfed a little bit too much. So I think this spell could easily be C tier. Very situational, just not a good card. Storm Prism, I think I'm going to put that in A tier with Mass Prism, just pretty solid for PvE, kind of bad in PvP. Storm Shark, C tier, easily. The DPP is kind of mid, and the conditional is pretty cool, but you don't really have a way to get 2 heals as a Storm right now. The ways you can get 2 heals are either just awful and a waste of time, or they'll run out before you can actually use them and get any value. So I think it is C tier. Minus 80 shields are just, you know, incredibly powerful. I think, you know, if somebody has a minus 80 storm shield, that pretty much just makes them immune with this thing on. So easy A tier. Pierce Blades need a buff. Now, the devs want us to use Pierce Blades, and I don't really see why. You know, when you compare this to like a 35 Stormblade or something, it's just kind of a joke right now in a lot of players' opinions, and it takes up a lot of deck space that your opponent isn't going to have to run. So you're just giving up deck space and stats when your opponent doesn't have to. So I think this spell, at least for Storm, needs a rework. Storm Trap. Now, Storm Trap's actually pretty interesting. It's not as good as Blade objectively, but you could honestly swap things around. Like if you're, blading on a Storm, you can maybe swap to Traps because they're countering your Blades to just get the buffs out, right? There is cool stuff you could do, but they're a little bit weaker than Blades, so you don't really see a lot of players shift and do that, but Traps are decent, nothing too special. Stormzilla needs a buff, really bad damage per pip, and very useless utility because, I mean, the damage per pip on the utility is pretty good, but the gambiting 3 weaknesses is typically a bad idea, and then the heals don't last very long, and then the heals are like nothing, so it's just pretty bad right now. Supercharge, I think easily, I mean, in PvE, probably C tier, probably, it's okay in PvE in some fights. Typically just gets countered in PvP. Also, a lot of the time when you do this in PvE, you have to supercharge, then wait like 3 or 4 rounds, which is pretty annoying. Unless you just Tempest, I guess, but I don't know what you're doing at that point, So, I would like to see the spell get buffed and maybe not consume every pip. Or have like a spell-lamented version that's a little bit different, potentially. It's a cool gimmick, cool spell, but it's just not really used that often in PvE or PvP. Tempest, easy S tier, don't need to talk about that. Just really, really good card. If there's one thing I could nitpick, I think the damage per pip is honestly a little bit too low, in my opinion. Storm damage per pip is supposed to be, I think, 135 or 125, and this one is 80. I know it's an AoE, but that's like a pretty big chunk of percentage off just for it being AoE. You can compare this to like cards like Judgment, and Judgment just completely outshines it in every way in PvP. So I wouldn't mind seeing a buff like even like 90 per pip to Tempest. I think would go a long way in my opinion. Thermic Shield, C tier, very situational. Bad shield against fire, pretty good against ice, kind of mid. Thunder Snake needs buff. It's really bad in terms of damage per pip and really bad in terms of utility. Triton, A tier, pretty decent top path. I think the damage per pip is a little bit low on it, at least for max level. And the Spellment is pretty good with the 55 blades. Wall Bolt, easy B tier, it's all in or not kind of spell. Really good if you hit max, but the risk obviously is what makes players not want to run it, basically. And lastly, we have Windstorm. Windstorm, I think, is going to have to be probably C tier. I think this spell is just really weak right now, at least for Storm, unfortunately. You're pretty much better off auraing or blading and just going from there, and not wasting a whole pip on Windstorm right now. If the spell was 0 pip, like Mass Trap, I think it would probably be used a lot more in terms of Storm PvE. But in terms of PvP, just really bad. And yeah, that's my tier list, guys. It's probably a longer video, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you guys think about this in the comments below. And I will see you guys on the next one. Thank you for watching, and as always, take care, y'all.